Hi, everyone. I want to welcome all McGill alumni, members of the campus community, and friends. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Griffin Mesmer, and I'm a graduate of McGill's Faculty of Engineering. I've since moved away from engineering, and I'm currently working as an intellectual property attorney at the law firm of Troutman Pepper in Boston, and I focus my practice on patent disputes. But more importantly, I'm a proud member and current vice president of the McGill Alumni Association of Boston. McGill has branch associations across the world, with some of the largest being in the US, including in Boston and New York. The branches are proud McGill alumni whose goal is to connect alumni with each other and with the university through meaningful engagement opportunities in the region, like through this webcast. We plan to host a variety of events and get-togethers, which we will eventually move to the digital front. We've since moved some book clubs, trivia nights, and other events. You should be on the lookout for those if you're interested. I also encourage everyone to look for and get involved with a branch in your area. It's a great way to make meaningful connections, stay involved in McGill, and learn about great events like the one we have for today. Of the event today, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to welcome you all to today's webinar. Today's topic is about where things stand 1 year into the pandemic, including the efficacy of the approved vaccines, the impact of the variants of concern, and the varying success of vaccine rollout strategies in the US, Canada, and across the globe. If you have questions that you would like to ask the speakers during the course of the webinar, please submit them in the chat box, which you should have as part of your webinar software. We'll do our best to answer your questions, as many as we can throughout this session. And this brings me to the introduction of today's moderator and guest speaker. Handling today's questions and discussion is our moderator, Dr. Shan Soe-Lin. Dr. Soe-Lin is the Managing Director at Pharos Global Health Advisors and is a lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. She has advised developing countries and NGOs on COVID-19 control and has published several op-eds on this topic in major news outlets. Also joining us for this discussion is Dr. Tim Evans. Dr. Evans is the inaugural Director and Associate Dean of the School of Population and Global Health, as well as the Associate Vice Principal of Global Policy and Innovation. He is also the Executive Director of the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force, which was launched by the Canadian government in April 2020. We are excited to have Dr. Soe-Lin and Dr. Evan here with us today and to hear what they have to say. So with that, welcome again to all, and I turn the presentation over to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Griffin, for that kind introduction, and hello to everyone in the McGill community. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very pleased to be asked to have this chance to have a conversation with Dr. Evans, who's been a friend for a long time, but also I think a really important guiding light on several pandemics in years past, but also most importantly now on COVID-19, especially through his role as the co-chair of Canada's COVID Immunity Task Force. So I think before we get into it, just a short stock taking. Tim and I have been in conversations about COVID really since even right when it launched, and so for me, I was just thinking and reflecting upon the different kinds of conversations we've had, and especially looking back to the first one that we had last March, where there was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, but Tim, where you offered a lot of steady guidance and a lot of reasons for optimism. And I think now, April 7th, 2021, 13 months, I would say, after everything hit the fan a year ago, we now are at this incredible precipice where we have at least 4 vaccines that are proving to be really effective. And at least there's a way out from this mess. But I was asked to focus this talk, at least on some comparisons between the US and Canada. I think there's a lot to be celebrated on both sides. Canada has, on a per capita basis, I think 1/3 of the cases and deaths that we've had here in the US. Canada as a country has done much better compared to the US, which has been a low bar about managing their COVID-19 crisis, but at the same time, 80% of the deaths were in nursing homes, which I think is a tremendous loss. I'd say only 60% here in the US, but that's, to me, a pretty big difference. Another big difference also is that Canada has done probably the best job among all OECD countries to have secured 9 doses of vaccine per person, but right now I think the delivery is extremely slow, and only 16% of Canadians have received at least 1 shot, and that's compared to 33% here in the US. I think they've just announced that the US had reached a new high of 4 million shots per day given last Saturday. So I think there's a lot of things to celebrate, a lot of things to look forward to, but we're not out of the woods yet. There's a long way to go before everyone is vaccinated and protected. So I think today we're going to be focusing on taking stock of what happened, what we need to do to get out all the way, and then also what Canada and the US can think about to do to prepare for the next one. So Tim, not sure if you had any other remarks or whether I should just start firing away.
No, I think you captured very clearly why I decided to move from the United States to Canada.
I think that was wise and smart. So just to get started as a broad question to you, Tim, just looking back over the past year, what are the successes that you think have been the biggest and most profound ones for Canada, and what could Canada have done better?
Yeah, Canada's greatest resource is its people. And if you look at adherence to all of the tough behavioral measures, from washing hands to social distancing to use of masks to avoiding congregate settings, Canadians as a population as a whole have done remarkably well. And the evidence on that is something that our COVID-19 Immunity Task Force generated when we started looking at levels of infection as measured by antibodies in the blood. And we found after the first wave that less than 1% of the Canadian population had been exposed. In most other countries, it was somewhere between 5 to 10, and parts of the United States 10 to even 20% in New York State. So that's primarily a function of good behaviors. And then when we measured again after the second wave, or well into the second wave in January of this year, still just about 2% of Canadians showed exposure to infection. And again, this is an indication of a really, on the whole, excellent adherence to public health measures. So Canadians are very compliant, adherent, and that's been great in terms of preventing worse outcomes and consequences relative certainly to other countries. However, with so few people exposed, it's meant that the number of susceptibles for further waves of infection remains extremely high, especially in the absence of vaccines being rolled out as quickly as we'd like. And so as we move now into a third wave, our public health behavior needs to continue to be amazingly and incredibly vigilant because we still remain very, very susceptible, especially in the age of variants, to further infection. So people is really what has made the difference and will make the difference moving forward.
Are you optimistic that Canadians can still maintain that vigilance again as we enter this next, hopefully final wave before the vaccines can catch up?
You know, it gets tougher and tougher, but I think, you know, the metaphor we could use is we're into the third period of the hockey game. And as everybody knows, that's the most exciting period. And that's when, you know, you go for it. I hope this is a third wave. I don't think we want to get a third period and we finish with it. I worry that there may be overtime in the fall with the fourth wave. But I think continuing to encourage people to do the right thing is, and really not squander the great foundation, is going to be extremely important in terms of messaging. Everybody's tired, and so it becomes increasingly difficult. And that's why the fastest way out of this is to do 24/7 vaccination.
Well, I certainly hope that we're not going into sudden death overtime either in Canada in this last push. And as a Canadian living in the US, I'm sure along with others being really horrified at how public health got turned into such a political spectacle. And glad anyway that Canada, it seemed, didn't do that as much. and was much more unified and coherent in the public health messaging. Moving ahead to vaccines now, there are currently 4, I believe, approved for use, Moderna and Pfizer, which are these new mRNA-based platform vaccines, AstraZeneca and J&J. So I think there's been a lot of curiosity and a lot of questions about what are the differences between these vaccines. Are they all equally effective? Does it matter which one I get? And a lot of confusion around safety, especially for Astra. So would be very curious to hear your thoughts on that. What are your recommendations for Canadians? Should they take whichever one they're given? And what do you make of the new evidence and controversies in Europe and elsewhere around the potential safety and blood clots and those kinds of things that have been associated with Astra?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I would underline is we have to consider ourselves lucky as a global civilization to have as many effective vaccines 1 year into the pandemic, and recognize that the fastest time to develop a vaccine prior to this pandemic was 4 years. And so we've shrunk that time period and come up with extremely good vaccines. The mRNA vaccines, it's even more interesting because it's the first time a proof of concept with that technology in a vaccine. And so it has not only great opportunity for COVID, but perhaps other challenges, health challenges that we face. In general, the performance of the vaccines is excellent. And we have efficacies that range from 95% to 66% with the J&J. The AstraZeneca is about 70%, and the 2 mRNA vaccines are around 90–95%. What that means is that the measure of effectiveness was to prevent illness. And so that means on the lower end that 7 out of 10 cases of illness would be prevented with the vaccine, to 9 out of 10 or 9.5 out of 10. And those results in the realm of vaccines are on their own very good. But if you change the parameter of interest to severe illness and death, the efficacy goes up for all of the vaccines to over 90%. And if the real measure that we care about is keeping people out of ICUs and out of the morgue, then we have a set of vaccines that are terrific. And we're really fortunate to have them. So my view is any vaccine is better than no vaccine in terms of the ones that are available. Having said that, there are some concerns about the AstraZeneca vaccine in terms of a very rare clotting disorder, which may be linked to the vaccine. And we still don't have enough information and data to know the extent of that. And it's a tough one to call, because there's suggestions that this may be profiling women under the age of 55 disproportionately. However, the jury's still out on this, and I think therefore caution is reasonable, particularly at this time. But recognize that doesn't mean, as we've seen in the UK, where this vaccine has been rolled out extensively, that without any illness or ill effects that we're aware of, that these vaccines have many populations, all those over the age of 55, where they can be used very well. So we're lucky to have this selection because we can substitute if necessary, if we think that there's a particular risk for a certain subsegment of the population with these vaccines. So on the whole, I'm incredibly positive. This is our exit strategy for the pandemic, and science has delivered in an extraordinary way.
I mean, as a former bench scientist, I got my PhD from McGill in 2009. I was just super emotional and just I hadn't really prepared or even thought about what that would mean to get a vaccine against a global pandemic in under a year. And I hope people can appreciate what a triumph that is, and also to see in real life the power of vaccines, especially in Israel and the UK that have reached very high levels of population coverage, 60% in Israel and almost 50 in the UK, and seeing what happens as the cases just drop very, very suddenly. So these vaccines work in real life. It's just frustrating that we're not there yet in either the US or Canada to get up to the levels of coverage that we would hope for to be able to see these returns. But what a triumph for science. And so again, I hope everyone heard Dr. Evans loud and clear. All the vaccines are great at preventing the most important outcomes, which are severe illness and hospitalizations. So whatever jab you can get, you should take it, I think, if I can summarize what you were saying, Dr. Evans. So moving on to maybe some clouds in the sky. I was just reading today, I think on CBC or CTV, which I haven't read in quite some time, but seeing that the Brazil variant P1 is making its presence felt in Canada, and the UK variant B117, which is proved to be a very fast spreader, has also taken hold in Canada as well as the US. It's being blamed here anyway for the big surge in the Midwest. What is your take on these variants of concern? Are they, how important are they? Do you think the vaccine will hold up against them? Are you worried at all about these and potentially future variants?
Yeah, well, I think it's worrying, and it's worrying because what we're seeing is the degree of transmissibility seems to be the primary common denominator across all of these variants. And I was listening to a call on the situation in Brazil about a week ago, and I have to say it was simply scary to hear the rate at which you have uncontrolled, disseminated community-wide infection. With, I think yesterday they recorded 4,000 deaths. So that's the Armageddon specter that I think keeps all of us up at night. Having said that, I'm massively encouraged. You mentioned UK and Israel. They've gotten out ahead on the vaccine versus variants race. Vaccines got way out ahead. And we have to remember that in the UK, variants appeared first before vaccine approval in November, and the B117. And so there's no reason why we couldn't have seen and there was lots of concern that we might see a very serious deterioration in situation in the UK. But what we've seen is the opposite. With an accelerated distribution of the vaccine, the rates of illness, hospitalization, and death in the UK have all descended dramatically and don't show any evidence at the moment of turning into a third wave. We see exactly the same situation in Israel as well. And these are the two countries, as you said, that have moved furthest and fastest on vaccination. And further in Canada, where we have very good coverage now in long-term care facilities, both amongst workers and residents, we're seeing a similar pattern. We're seeing very few cases and almost no deaths. And so this is evidence that the vaccines appear to be working. To boot, we had a great presentation from a Canadian immunologist who's lost her way and is working at Harvard, I believe. But she knows her immunology inside out, and we had the benefit of her teaching us Luddites on the ins and outs of vaccine immunology. And she was indicating that, in fact, the immune response, when you look at not just the peripheral measures in terms of humoral or the antibodies circulating in the peripheral blood. But if you look at the engine room of the immune system, the T cells and B cells, she said, you're seeing a very robust immune response that looks as if it's got good durability and is likely to stand up to these variants. So the science is emerging that the vaccines may have, in fact, given us much better protection for these variants than we had initially anticipated. The P1 in Brazil remains a big question, and so we have to watch that very, very, very carefully. Encouragingly, industry is already thinking about redesigning vaccines with variants in mind, and this is particularly one of the silver linings from the mRNA platform, which is it's quite facile in terms of changing its design and redirecting it to cover changes in the variants. So on the whole, I'm very concerned but optimistic that provided we can get vaccines out and into people's arms, we will win the vaccines versus variants race.
Well, I hope so, but you're often right. So let's keep our fingers crossed. But this is a war of attrition in some ways. We need to take as many people off the battlefield as we can quickly, which is what the vaccines are trying to do. So moving on to that next point, can you explain to us in the US, how is it possible that Canada had secured kind of the most number of doses per Canadian, but has had so much challenge with supply and rollout?
Yeah, I think this is one of the great success stories in the Canadian response. I think this is a great question. We've received a lot of critique as being avaricious and greedy. How could any Canadian need more than 9 jabs? But nobody knew when these advanced purchase agreements were made back in September of 2020 with various vaccine developers that didn't have any evidence at that time that their vaccines were going to work. They're all in phase 3 clinical trials. And so Canada gambled and it hedged its bets. And it said, you know, if 3 of these vaccines or 2 or 1 of these vaccines works, at least we're playing the field. 1 of 9 or 2 of 9, that's better than betting on a single horse and that horse losing. And so these advanced purchase agreements were developed on speculation. It provided a great incentive to the vaccine manufacturers because in a sense it was guaranteeing a market should they be successful, and encouraged many of them to increase their manufacturing capacity prior to knowing they had a viable product. And so I think these have put Canada in a very good position such that we now have 4 vaccines, and it looks as if we will have the supply that's necessary to vaccinate the population by at least the 3rd quarter of this year. And we did that because we don't have a national production capacity. And so this was, I think, a smart strategy in the setting where we couldn't rely on a national manufacturer. And I don't think that's necessarily the best strategy for the long term, but in the setting, I think they did a really, really smart move. And I'm not sure they're getting enough credit for it from my perspective. The other thing that was great and is great is that Health Canada has accelerated their approval process. So instead of vaccine approval taking over a year, it now has been done for the set of 4 vaccines that have been approved somewhere between 2 and 3 months. And that's without compromising standards. And so I think that's another sign where regulatory frameworks can accelerate with a view to getting products out that we know are going to save lives and help us move beyond where we are with this pandemic.
Well, I think that's wise to be able to remind everyone that decisions have to be made without all the information that you would want at hand. Looking ahead, I think I read that Canada might be wanting to reboot or revive its vaccine production capabilities by buying a plant in Toronto. Do you think, looking ahead to the future, should Canada be trying to revive its otherwise moribund vaccine production facilities? I mean, there were somewhat good reasons for consolidating it and having companies make their production more efficient. That's why those plants were closed in the first place. But also, this might be kind of too wonky for this audience, but knowing all the work that you've done for childhood vaccines with Gavi and doing these big advanced purchase agreements and trying to pool demand to increase market power, is there any sense in trying to do regional agreements with the U.S. and Mexico, say, to have a whole North American force that's going to go out and try to buy and secure and support R&D in the future? Because what Canada and Mexico needs relative to the U.S. is sort of a fraction. Would that have been better if there had been enough doses secured for at least all of North America?
Yeah, well, I think, Shan, this is a really, really important issue. And I think if Canada thinks it can develop a national manufacturing capacity for vaccines based on the Canadian market, then that's 20th century thinking. I think if Canada wants to be a global competitor in a 7.5 billion person market for vaccines that may take many forms and address many issues, then we have certainly the brain power, we have the business acumen, and we should be positioning ourselves to be a global player. That, to me, is the future. And if indeed we can get our act together and figure out how to position ourselves either by supporting Canadian industry or working with partners who have a shared mission and doing things in an innovative way in order to enter the market and be viable in the market, I think those are the strategies that have a very positive double bottom line, which is one, good for the health and good for the economy.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I hope that Canada starts to make those investments. Vaccine manufacturing plant is not cheap. It's at least $500,000 or $1 billion. So it's and it has to be a solid business case to show that there's a market for what that plant is producing. So it's complex, but I think critically important, because this is not, unfortunately, the last pandemic that we're going to see in our time. So moving along to vaccine rollout, at least one of the silver linings, I suppose, of Canada being a little bit slower is that you can learn from the mistakes and successes of other countries that have gone faster. And at least in the US here, every state has done its own thing, and there's been huge tension between equity and efficiency about trying to reserve the doses for the oldest, and then now getting into arguments about who's most at risk from an occupational standard. And now I think everyone has just given up and said, it's wide open, go for it. What are your thoughts? I know Canada's going stepwise now by age. Do you think that's the right approach? Should Canada have been thinking about other things, maybe doing more hotspot targeting? I know it has been doing some of that in Ontario, but doing that in a more deliberate and intentional way. Are there ways that what few doses Canada had could have been used to more intelligently to save more lives, or is this as good as it could have been?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and I have to give the Biden administration in the United States a lot of credit. They're way ahead of their 100-day targets, and to achieve 4 million vaccinations in a day that's almost a third of what we've achieved in 3 months in Canada. So that's power to a very pluralistic system, which is primed and given the political support necessary to move mountains. And despite a few glitches here and there that you read about in the media, on the whole, I'm very impressed at what's happening in the United States. Canada's taken a different strategy. and I think this is really important. We followed very much what the UK has done. And the UK did a first dose fast approach and then spread out the interval for the second dose. And this was again based on the evidence that severe illness, hospitalization, death after the first jab was very rare. And therefore, you could get more doses into people's arms, which gave them a very good protection. And then that would allow you to have a better impact on the trajectory of the pandemic in terms of taking away people who are susceptible. So I think the UK strategy has thus far been bared out in terms of the results, and Canada very much has modeled its vaccine distribution on that basis. I think one of the things we've seen in the context of the variants arising, but not only in the context of variants arising, is that the areas of greatest risk to infection, the populations with greatest risk to infection, have been the ones where the areas where the variants have settled and found susceptibles. And these are not only essential workers that don't have a choice about going to a congregate setting for working, but they also live in postal codes in Canada that are on the lower end of material deprivation, and they're very highly correlated with racialized communities. And one of my great concerns in the context of Canada is that after the first wave, we had uncontrovertible evidence of the inequalities that were emerging. We saw much higher rates of infection in racialized communities and in communities with high material deprivation. And at the end of the second wave in January, the mid part of the second wave of January, we saw that those inequities had actually increased by as much as 5-fold in those populations, which meant that the rate of growth in the epidemic in Canada was somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times faster in racialized communities and communities of material deprivation than it was in communities, white communities, and much richer communities. So I think that difference was in front of us, and because of that, we should have had a more proactive approach to vaccination, which we're beginning to see now, which is people who have no choice but to go and work in a congregate setting. They shouldn't be allowed into those settings without having been vaccinated. And so I'm a big believer that we should have vaccination tents at places of work. You take vaccines to the people, you don't take people to the vaccines. And you should have a full court press on vaccinating every essential worker in those settings, because it's not simply keeping those work settings safe, it's also the communities that they live in. They often live in multi-generational households. So I believe, yes, a course correction is overdue in terms of targeting those populations as high priority.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I was really, I guess, shocked on one hand, but not shocked to see those maps of Montreal Island, and you can see there's exact overlay almost between the little towns and postal codes you said, with the most dense, the most disadvantaged, and the highest rates of COVID. It maps, I think, almost 100% neatly. And I would hope that Canada would pivot quickly and realize also that vaccines can be used to save lives, but they can also be used to cut transmission. And if you want to get the economy open, you want to stop these lockdowns, you need all of that. If you want all of that to happen, you need to stop the spread. So pivoting quickly from life-saving, now that the nursing homes have been covered, as you said, and the staff in the nursing homes have been covered, and moving now attention to trying to stop transmission to the most vulnerable communities would be, in my opinion, the most important thing as well. So can you comment on what you think made Canada perform better than the US, at least in the beginning? I know you touched on Canadian values, a lot of the strengths of Canadian society that have been quite different than the US, but were there also other lessons learned from SARS, from other previous brushes with pandemics that you think might have also helped Canada get off to a faster start, at least in the beginning?
You know, my frank answer there would be no. SARS was a flash in the pan relative to what we're dealing with now, and it was, 15 plus years ago, 2003, 2004. So we did have a crise de conscience at that time, which resulted in the Naylor report, which recommended the creation of the Public Health Agency of Canada, which was a good thing. And I think having a public health agency serves a real purpose. We've seen that sustaining the vitality and the functionality of that agency has been difficult. And serendipitously, perhaps, a review of the Public Health Agency of Canada was commissioned in 2019, ahead of the pandemic. And it identified a hemorrhaging of depth technical expertise with a move to bureaucratization. And I think that's a risk in any institution that is federally funded or funded by government. But I think we're seeing that instead of this institution having the technical leadership that you would expect, it's rather been what I'd call a federal convener and communicator of what's going on, which has value. But I think it's been not punching at the weight that a first-class public health agency could. So there's multiple dimensions to the functions. So it's, glib diagnostics, I think, have no role. Sober and comprehensive audits do. And I think once we get beyond, once we really get to the light at the end of the tunnel, that's the time when we have to have an after-action review. And not only do a very serious audit of all the functions and capacities of the Public Health Agency of Canada and the National Microbiology Lab, but all the other institutions that are critical, including schools of population and global health. We are one of the primary engines related to knowledge and training. And the mirror should be reflected on us, and hard questions should be asked. Are we doing our jobs properly? Are we developing the sorts of cadres that are needed in the numbers and in the places? Can we move at more than one speed? And so people familiar with the McGill administration might roll their eyes, but I think we have an accountability and we should be fully part of that audit of critical institutions, such that the next crisis, which will not be in a century, I guarantee, will be more likely within a decade, that we are much better prepared and able to respond.
Well, I think that was a very rich and sobering answer. Are you optimistic that this will scare people enough to want to make those investments in public health? As public health practitioners, no one really cared about us before these big things happened. We're an unsung workforce in some ways. That and one of the hardest things about public health is that you don't get credit for the things that you prevented if they didn't happen, and so no one gets worried about it. If you think about all these sort of near disasters that have happened in the U.S. around hurricanes, it didn't make people get any more prepared, and yet people are surprised still when the next hurricane comes and the same things happen. And to me, if you're an immunologist or an infectious disease specialist, you could imagine even bigger, somewhat realistic pandemics. Like, I'm not sure that COVID-19 was the big one. There's even bigger ones you could think about. So are you confident, do you think, that Canada will be smart enough to really do that after action review, as you said, do a real one, a full accounting, including whether Canada has made the right investments in research, because that's where the solutions get generated, and fortify the walls for the next one?
I think it's a great question, Shan, in part because what, in a behavioral sense, what happens both at an individual and a societal level, especially in a prolonged crisis that we've been enduring longer than anyone ever thought, and still not over, the immense fatigue and sense of relief that one would generate when it's finally over is one which corresponds with a very well defined behavioral cycle of you panic during the crisis and then you fall into neglect. You just don't think it'll happen again, and you just don't want to think about it anymore. And so I think one has to be aware that that is a very natural behavioral response. And so one has to prepare and say, actually, as painful as it is to continue to focus on it, this is when we can really invest to build back fair and better. Examples where this has made a difference are really important. And, you know, I spent a fair part of my life in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh gets cyclones regularly coming up the Bay of Bengal and ripping through the Delta, which is the country of Bangladesh. And when the country was born 50 years ago, it got hit by a cyclone that killed about 500,000 people, 500,000 people. And the same sort of cyclone today, because of investments in storm shelters and early warning, kills 5 to 10 people. And so that's evidence that it does make a difference. If you can build back systems that are going to be much better prepared and much more intelligent and able to manage these sorts of crises. So it's a great investment. The other thing I'd say is that this is one where it's not purely a public sector investment. As we talked about the vaccine markets, there are a whole set of health commodities. There's an industry on health information, and these are areas where I think Canada could position itself in a way which doesn't make this all preparing for a rainy day, but actually a set of activities that have real currency value in terms of jobs and positioning the Canadian economy in the 21st century to be competitive and resilient.
Well, I got to convince my husband to let us come back.
We'll work on it now. We're trying to open the border.
I know. We're going to just open the border so we can all come home. But I just want to weave in a few of the audience questions here. Just wanted to ask if you're able to expand a little bit more on why you think that the pandemics are not over and you're going to see another one in 10 years.
Yeah, well, I think in the ecosystem that we're living on this planet, we're challenging the divides between the animal kingdom and the human kingdom. There's a strong sense that what happened in this case is what happens in a lot of cases when viruses that had previously been only found in the animal kingdom jump through some form of mutation and become transmissible in humans. So those, we call those zoonoses, but there's no reason to believe why we won't see more. If you look back over the last 10 years or 12 years from H1N1 in 2009, we've had Ebola virus disease, we had Middle East respiratory syndrome, we had Zika, and I'm probably missing one or two, but every 2 or 3 years we've had very serious outbreaks which have brought us into dealing with transborder threats in a very major way. So I don't see that changing at all. I think this is in many respects the new normal. and it's a real challenge to humanity, like other challenges such as climate change, where we're really going to have to invest much more of our intellectual and our ingenuity in order to figure out how to survive and thrive as a planet.
Well, certainly these risks of spillover events are more and more, especially as people continue to encroach into wildlife areas, as you said, and also just increased globalization, more air routes, more ways for these outbreaks to get spread very quickly. So looking back, I think we were lucky until we weren't. So before we fully turn over, I have a few other questions, some of a technical nature. There's been several questions asking if you could explain more about why this dose delay is a good idea, and whether it's safe or whether we're sacrificing any part of efficacy. I'm just going to group these because they're all somewhat similar. Also, whether you can mix and match vaccines. If someone already got a first dose of Astra, they want to know if they can get the second dose of J&J. And another question around blood thinners, which is if they're on blood thinners, if that's okay still to get Astra. That one you might want to consult your actual personal physician for, but thought I would ask you also since you're an MD.
Great. Okay. Well, those are three great questions. On the dose delay, as I said, the model on this has been the UK, and based on the evidence they had of very low rates of severe illness following the first jab, that they extended the second dose to 12 weeks, and that enabled them to get to more people more quickly and cut the number of susceptibles, and therefore curtail the epidemic much more quickly, rather than respecting the recommended dosing interval and fully vaccinating a much smaller number of people. So that was a calculated decision, and it looks as if it's worked. So the risks are that there is some suggestion based on analysis of the immune response after the first dose, that elderly people who are in long-term care, they may not have as robust an immune response as people, as younger people. And indeed, this is evidence out of Canada, small group, but it's consistent with the recognition that for people with weaker immune systems, which may be natural because of age or due to some form of immunocompromise, that they are more likely to need the boost possibly earlier. When I say possibly, when I referred to the brilliant Canadian immunologist who had lost her way and ended up at Harvard, she was indicating that those peripheral measures of immunity may not be reflective of effective, or what we call protective immunity. And so there's more going on in the immune engine room than we're aware, perhaps even in those older populations, which may continue to be protective. However, having said that, I think for immunocompromised populations, for the elderly, we should be, if supplies permit, we should be moving as much as possible to an earlier second dose. The second thing to realize relating to dosing interval is that sometimes a longer wait is better. And this is in fact what was found out in the AstraZeneca clinical trials. And so I think that there is evidence, and we've seen this in other vaccine preventable diseases, where you actually get a better boost with the second dose if it's delayed a little bit. So having said all that, I think we need to continue to monitor closely the dose delay, or I call the first jab fast strategy. But the evidence to date is suggesting this is very safe. On mix and match, it's a fantastic question. There are lots of people who think, in fact, it might be advantageous to have a mix and match because it may give you a more robust stimulation of the immune system with two different types of stimulation. The short answer is none of us know. The good news is our immunity task force 2 weeks ago approved a 13-arm clinical trial, which is doing every mix and match combination across the 4 vaccines that you can imagine. And so we should have some understanding of whether just keeping 2 Pfizers or 2 Modernas or 2 AstraZenecas versus one and Moderna and a Pfizer, or a Moderna and AstraZeneca, or the other, that we'll have some evidence of what the relative benefits are. In terms of blood thinners, I think this is something that's best to discuss with your physician or your clinician. The one thing I'd say is we're talking about a very, very rare side effect related to the AstraZeneca vaccine. And so I think you should get advice from your clinician in terms of whether avoiding the AstraZeneca is better, or whether your blood thinners are in any way put you at a differential risk with respect to that or another vaccine. So I'm not going to opine on that, knowing the state of my clinical skills. Very rusty.
Well, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you 2 questions, I guess. So one is, given where we are now and where we were a year ago, how optimistic are you about the possibility of a return to normal life? Are things going to go back to the way that they were? Are they going to go back to where they were, but with some key differences? And do you think that Canadians are at least maybe emotionally better prepared for the sacrifices of the next pandemic? And lastly, for this audience, I was hoping you could also speak to what the school is doing and what it has done around COVID-19, and how you see the school contributing to the next series of pandemic preparedness, and also what alumni can do to stay in touch and to stay up to date with all the comings and goings of the school.
Great. Well, thanks, Sean. I'm, as you stated at the outset, we're deep now into a 3rd wave, and it's hard to be optimistic in that setting, especially as the writing has been on the wall for this for the last month, and it's really heartbreaking in many respects to see it unroll in front of us, especially when you could see it coming 2-3 weeks ago. As I said, I am very, very optimistic on the vaccines, and Canada on the whole is doing a pretty good job. We're about of the vaccines that have been distributed to provinces, about 2/3 of them have been delivered, and their systems, I think, are getting more efficient every day. So I think the vaccines are really a reason for optimism. We do have a serious hump to get over in this 3rd wave, and I think that's going to test our patience. If we get to 80% of the adult population vaccinated by September, then I'm confident we can minimize the risk of a 4th wave. So that's where I see the trajectory in the near term. I do not believe that we will be returning to the old ways of business. I think we'll be returning to a new normal. I think there'll be huge issues related to socialization and congregation in the future. And as much as we miss it, there'll probably be all sorts of anxieties related to walking around without masks in a closed room. So there'll be some period where we will have to understand it, but I think there's some real silver linings related to being able to work very effectively from home, for example, not have to commute all the time. There's been a large environmental dividend. Bicycles have become the new mode of urban transport. These are things that I think we should look at and continue to sort of encourage, rather than simply say we should move back to what was the pre-pandemic normal. Let me finish quickly in terms of things we're doing at the school, because in many respects, as you were saying earlier, that the pandemic in some respects couldn't have come at a better time for McGill University, that's trying to get a new school of population and global health going, because the world's attention is on this global health issue. And there are probably more people today that know not only what an epidemiologist is, but what a positive predictive value is, and how to analyze a diagnostic test accuracy or the efficacy of a vaccine. And so there's a huge public engagement, and I think it's very important for the school to, in a crude way, take advantage of that, because it won't last forever. So we're delighted to be launching the school in September of this year, at the time of the bicentenary homecoming. And we're going to launch a pandemic emergencies preparedness learning lab. The acronym is PEOPLE, and it will, as you might expect, address what universities do on this front: knowledge, education, and outreach. On the knowledge front, we've got a great crew of data scientists that are working on predictive and proactive data initiatives, which include modeling, redesign of testing systems, and also bringing, very importantly, ethics and trust by design into those data systems. So that's one area that we think is really exciting. It speaks to comparative advantage. On the education front, we think there's a huge talent deficit that needs to be addressed. And Shan, you and Rob and I were put on a course in the fall called, that I like to refer to as Learning on the Fly. It was policy perspectives on pandemics now and in the past. And when you look at the faculty who assembled from the four corners of the earth, the students couldn't have had a more enriching 1.5 hours for 12 weeks in the fall. And it wasn't only the students. I think I learned a huge amount as well, and everybody who participated. That's something we could never have done in peacetime. And to have people link in by Zoom and share their experience, I think is the promise of enriched education opportunity. That's not only good for McGill, but all sorts of other institutions. So we're very excited about that, and cashing in on and addressing the talent deficit. And one other area in that is we're looking to launch a program for global health entrepreneurs. And this is really looking at the deficit in individuals who can navigate and negotiate the global space to seize important opportunities that would make a discrete difference and improvement in addressing all sorts of different dimensions of pandemic challenges, from behavioral to diagnostic to protective equipment to therapeutics to vaccines. And the last area is outreach. We think it's very important to be in touch with our communities. And as I said, we look forward to undergoing an audit and understanding how we can improve with other institutions. But we're just beginning an effort to promote back to work safety. And we think this will be an opportunity to work with all sorts of public and private sector partners to look at how you can make sure that those congregate settings that people will be going back to in the fall are safe and health promoting. And so in many respects, this is a revitalization of occupational health. But those are some of the things that we're thinking about in this pandemic emergencies preparedness learning lab.
Well, it all sounded really exciting, and that course that we did in the fall was really fun, and we didn't know how that was going to go because we were making it up as we were going along and following in real time. We were following COVID. COVID was telling us what to do.
We thought about it 5 years ago.
I know, that's right. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Griffin, who I think has some final thoughts, but just wanted to say thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone. This was really fun for me.
Great. Thank you, Shan.
A big thank you to everyone for coming. Would encourage you to stay in touch with both the Boston Alumni Group and also with the new school. I think you're doing a great job of having all of these different sessions that have really, I think, helped McGillians and anyone else stay safe and learn how to navigate this pandemic. Also so much to celebrate about the knowledge that you've brought together at McGill. So a big thank you. And Tim, I didn't know if you had any other last thoughts. I did want to say one thing. One question was for the new variants of concern, just a safety question. There's nothing more you can do except to double down on the things that you already know. So that means, social distancing, wearing double masks. But that's all you can do against the variants until you get vaccinated. But back to you, Tim, for the final word, and a big thank you to everyone.
Great. Well, thanks to you, Shan, and I'm sure Griffin, if he was on, would be singing your praises. And I'd just like to add my thanks to all of the people who signed on today and apologize for going on at length on issues. Happy to have any follow-up. So I'm sure there are lots of further questions, so please don't hesitate to get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And we look forward to continuing to communicate, and any of your suggestions on how we should be thinking about shaping the school are welcome. The last thing I'd say is this pandemic has been humbling to anybody and everybody. None of us had any idea that it would evolve as it's evolving, and every day we're humbled in many respects. So we continue to learn and hope, and in that setting, I wish you all the best and stay safe.